Well, thank you all for remaining here. I'm going to actually take us through a little mental exercise a little bit later in my talk. I have a lot of material here that kind of sets the stage. So even though I'm going to present a slide, I know that you've seen it already. I'm going to use it just as a reference point to get to a point later in our talk. My background is that I was with Sempra Energy for 7 years. I was the strategic technology strategist for the company. Worked with them quite a bit about the evolution of the utility, and I found that a lot of the work that I was doing with the utility was first of a kind. And the challenge when you do first of a kind is you have two risks. One is you buy the only product that ever gets built, or the other is that you get version 1. And what we wanted to do was ensure that as we were evolving the technology portfolio within Sempra, that there was a large community of other buyers. And so I ended up spending a lot of my time on the road talking to other utilities, ultimately working with the federal government and state governments to incent the utilities to make purchases so that Sempra wasn't the only buyer of some of this technology. As a result of all my work in the industry, I started to realize that there are some great opportunities out there, but I'm stuck in a utility. Those opportunities are for other people. So I left Sempra last year to form this company, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it as we go through the talk. Now, I know that a slide came up in the keynote yesterday about the rising price of energy across the United States. This slide is actually a snapshot, end of 2008 coming into 2009. And if you look at the lower numbers in each of those ovals, those are double-digit of inflation of energy costs. What we had witnessed was almost 5 continuous years of energy costs by the ratepayers as a direct result of many, many different factors. 2009 to 2010, we saw a huge cliff in that rise. But as soon as the economy starts to come back, we will again see this particular incident where energy costs will continue to rise. So just keep that in mind as we start talking about some of the drivers that will lead to hopefully a new paradigm shift. Also, we know that there's a tremendous amount of renewables. We've been talking about that for the last 2 days. Huge amounts. The labs are indicating significant increases just because it's now economically viable, and a lot of participants want to capture this market that's evolving. The biggest challenge for a lot of the large-scale renewables, and we've talked about this as well, but the biggest challenge is that it's fine to place enormous wind farms off the eastern shoreline or wind farms in Texas, but those aren't where the load centers are. The study that was done by NREL, I think it was NREL, one of the labs, maybe it's not NREL, NREL, indicated that to accommodate the mass deployment of wind generation on the eastern shoreline to reach all of the constituent cities that would be benefactors of that wind requires tens of thousands of miles of transmission lines. Now that seems daunting because the United States is only 300,000 miles across, but for heaven's sakes, you have to have a transmission line to the major load pockets, each one of the major cities. So you start to have an increased effect of the number of transmission lines. This is a very big challenge. Not even mentioning the fact that there's a tremendous investment in all of that transmission. But set that aside, how easy is it to build those transmission lines? If any of you have seen the effect of building the Sunrise Power Link in the San Diego area, you realize that transmission line was first conceived back in 2001, and the first report came out in 2002. Here it is, 2010, and we still haven't built the power line yet. This isn't an indication of how the way it will always be, but it sure is an anecdote about the realization that as we start to build all those bulk producers of power, we won't be able to accommodate it quickly with the transmission of it. This slide came up in another presenter's material as well. This is kind of a line of all the states that have a RPS, and what I did was I looked at what the overall arching goal for RPS was for that state, and then try to pull it back to 2015 to try to normalize it. I have a mistake with Maine. It's actually 40%, not 60%. 60% is actually 2025. The 2015 is 40%. But it's just an indication that all the states have, not all, many states have an RPS, which is kind of driving a need to build out renewable generation source. And if climate legislation is passed, the House side of the Congress has been pushing for 17%. The Senate has been pushing for 15%. Not knowing which one is going to win, it's not a question of will there be a nationwide RPS, just a matter of when. Again, we've had a lot of this information about the cost of different generation sources, but we're seeing that there's a high preponderance of interest in building out solar, and one of them that we haven't talked much about is biopower. This particular slide, if you take and use this for reference in the future, the light-colored bars have to do with the reference point of the cost of that particular generation source in 2003, 2004, and then the blue lines are the state of the industry in 2008. But it's what it's showing is that a lot of the large-scale suppliers of traditional sources of energy have actually pushed out to the right because their costs have increased dramatically. Now, we've seen this slide a number of times. I'm not going to belabor it. It's just that the fact that every component of the power generation supply has an incremental cost of capital. And when we start looking at the new paradigm that I'm about to talk to you about, this is a major component. So let's start taking a look at all the pieces in our power delivery system. This is the system that we've lived with for the last 110 years. On the generation side, we have tens of thousands of units. On transmission side, we've got close to 160,000 miles in the United States. Distribution, 3 million miles of distribution lines. Computers. Now, on the consumer side, we're starting to see this huge growth in distributed generation and demand response. The current state of the industry, less than 1% penetration is 12 million units of DG. Now let's start adding the wind parks that are coming in. We've been talking about those. They're being added to the transmission system. A large number of wind and solar farms are coming into the distribution system. Now we start adding all the solar, particularly in California. We've got the Million Rooftop Initiative, plus the economic levers that the federal government has been adding, that making it very economical for homeowners to put them on their homes. Commercial industrial buildings starting to add their own distributed generation. Right now, the time that this graph was put together, we had over 100,000 buildings that were actually power producers. And then we've already talked about what's happening with PVs, PHEVs. As we start to build this out, we have this incredibly complex engine that was already complex. It's 40, 50 years old, and we're adding more and more various sources of generation to it, which is putting incredible stress on this elaborate system where you have large-scale generation, transmits power down to the distribution, all the way down to the consumer. So, is there a business opportunity with all of these things that we're just witnessing? Let's think about how we engage the customer. Already the customer is starting to put solar rooftop, or they're putting biopower on their commercial or industrial property. Some of those customers are starting to think, well, can I use that power and deliver it back into the grid? And when Audrey was talking earlier, she talked about the concept of aggregating a number of suppliers of small generators and treating that as an aggregate and bidding it into the wholesale market. We've been doing that with demand response for the last several years. But now there's an interest in taking that same power production and placing it in the grid. And in California and some other states, they allow you to take your solar rooftop and place that back into the grid. there's going to be more and more interest to do that as the economic levers are provided by the local utilities or the ISOs. There is an opportunity here for us to start looking at a way to use that in this new business economy that we're about to discuss. So there's some legislation that's currently underway that actually references this term that we've been talking about kind of loosely today, and probably a couple times yesterday. The microgrid is really the concept where either the utility or an end-use customer can control and manage the power flow on their own facility. The utility's been doing this for years, but the utility tends to build a microgrid to island off a particular area that may have been stranded for some reason. Perhaps a feeder goes out or a generator goes offline, and an entire community then loses power. So what they do, the utility will bring in a localized power source or local storage facility to keep that community active. So if we're to take a look at how do we characterize what do microgrids look like, really what we have today are a lot of examples of R&D. The examples that we saw earlier in other presentations were various either laboratory reports. The list on the left identifies a number of countries or regions where they are conducting research and development on microgrids. The DOE, Department of Energy, let's see, this is Renewable Distribution System Integration. There were a number of projects that were funded. The solicitation went out for funding in 2007, and these are the awardees of various microgrid projects. San Diego Gas and Electric was one of the winners. This is the intent of using renewables and other types of strategies to create a microgrid. So what I'm trying to evidence here is the fact that what we see in the microgrid community today are mostly research projects. My question is, can we transition this research into a commercially viable opportunity? So when we talk about what are the reasons that an individual or a business owner would look at a microgrid, we look at some of the issues that they're dealing with. One might be that a particular business park or university has reliability challenges. As I mentioned, some utilities will want to sustain a feeder if there's an outage. What if the business owner wants to do that on their own? So they're willing to make an investment to maintain their own energy production. There might be economic reasons. If we take a look at the cost of energy from that earlier slide, if the costs continue to escalate over the years, and your typical facility, if you remember when the fellow from UCSD was talking today, he mentioned the fact that as energy costs rise, they start to look at how do we equalize our costs by making investments ourselves. If we can make a 20-year investment in a power plant for our own facility, then we can start to offset that rising cost. At some point, there's a break-even point. So there's a driver. The reliability issue is a driver. And then, as Audrey was talking about, if we can start to aggregate excess capacity and treat that as another economic opportunity for a business owner, then that also is a driver. So there are reasons why some of the customers would be actually interested into building all of this asset onto their own property. And then there are a number of elements within a microgrid that they would be interested in aggregating, maybe separately or maybe collectively. Distributed generation, distributed storage, distributed energy resources, demand response, and so on. Those are all elements that could be aggregated either into the wholesale market or even as offered as a resource to the local utility. So what I propose is that